Yeah, my name is Andrea. I'll introduce myself very briefly. Sometimes this is me in public. I'm round. I'm struggling with the public transportation, maybe with the pram as well. Probably sweating. And I'm just mentioning that in passing because I've become a parent in the past few years. And it's been a challenge to reconcile private and professional life. But with that in mind, I'll say that I'm nervous, but also I'll say thank you to the organizers and the volunteers here for including me, and I'm very grateful to participate here today. Also, I thought I would mention that I am a former outreachy intern and a documentarian. I'm mentioning this specifically because a few reasons. That in 2016, I got my first few steps in the open source world thanks to the outreachy internship program, and the stipend from the internship let me discover the Write the Docs conference in the community, pretty much by accident. And I'm mentioning this here because the very next presentation in this room, tomorrow morning at 10, is from Anna, who's going to speak about how the program works. And I hope that if you have a chance, you can go and listen and learn more about what the program does for the community. So we're going to move on. What are we here for today with me? I have prepared a call to action to reimagine how we understand knowledge and communication, which may be a little bit ambitious because everybody is probably tired. It's the end of the day. But let's see. I want us to break outside the box of thinking of ourselves as just content consumers or content creators. And in fact, I want to avoid the term content as much as possible, when possible. When we refer to content, it sounds to me pretty abstract and vague. There's like this connotation, this notion of passivity. And I find myself asking, what is content? What do we even mean when we refer to content? Because it's not knowledge, it's not expression, it's not information, it's not meaning, it's not memory, it's not truth, yet we use this term a lot. I find myself retreating a bit and thinking, for example, knowledge, human knowledge, is not content in itself. It's got a human element, there's nuance, there's texture, there's friction, color, dimension, a sense of temporality, and you can't always just collapse or flatten it into streams or packets of data. But we try, I guess. When we refer to content, it seems like we're referring to something that seems pretty universally replaceable or reproducible or interchangeable. Shapeless, formless stuff. And we end up reducing ourselves, thinking of ourselves as more machine than human, perhaps. And I just had the opportunity to catch just the last few minutes of the previous presentation, and I noticed there was a call to the community to help preserve the notion of tech writing as a skill in the workforce, and that is also my perspective here, by the way. Okay, we'll continue. So I will be, we'll be looking at things in three parts here. The first part will be tools. There'll be a second part referring to something calling the wall. And in conclusion, the third part, seed, soil, and growth. So with the first part, I did make a terrible mistake. I thought I could do this topic justice, the topic of tools, in the time that we have today. I am wrong, but let's see what happens. It's definitely a can of worms. And tools are not equivalent to solutions. Yet we often make the mistake of equating them as solutions to our problems. So maybe, yeah. Here, when I'm referring to tools, I'm referring to authoring frameworks and markup languages. That will be the context that we're referring to here. And as a disclaimer, there are many gaps in my knowledge and many things that are just definitely beyond the scope of this presentation. So we won't touch them. I guess one example of that is a discussion of semantics and their place in authoring and markup languages, documentation, so on. So with that in mind, I guess we're going to use a discussion of tools as a tool to facilitate and illustrate the potential of the documentation experience, hopefully. Naturally, none of the tools are one size fits all, and to explain my intentions a bit more, we will be looking at some historical context for these tools, a very high-level look at the language syntax, very, very high level, very brief. My intention with this section is to give a nod to Sphinx and restructured text and ASCII doc, since my understanding is that they have been favorite tools of choice in the open source community, and I didn't want to not even mention them here. Okay, and who knows, because I will be talking about this thing called MarkDoc, maybe someday we will find some more open source alternatives to MarkDoc that are not written in JavaScript. So, for the research, I consulted this presentation from Tony Ibbs at the Write the Docs conference in 2018 in Prague. He gave a very brief history of text markup languages. And his history starts in 1964. We're going to skip like 25, 27 years. But I will touch on an introduction to DocBook that came in 1991. It was introduced as a markup language that prioritizes readability, not readability, but findability and searchability. Not readability, apparently, because it was based in XML, or it is based in XML, and the syntax is very verbose. But there are many features, and it's still very much used in the open source world. And 10 years later, we have restructured text, which originated as a set of improvements in the Python project's doc set. So you can expect that the principles of restructured text follow the principles of Python, as far as I understand that. For example, here, a prioritization of readability. Restructured text is commonly implemented with the Sphinx documentation generator, in case you didn't know already. And Sphinx, among other things, it converts restructured text files into HTML. You will see a lot of projects from the Python world relying on Sphinx for their documentation, including Pyramid, Django, the Python project itself, and the Linux kernel outside of that. Maybe like a few more words on the topic of restructured text to show some of its benefits. It is extensible. I'm quoting here from a blog post from Eric Holscher, who wrote in 2016 about how restructured text and ASCII doc or ASCII doctor are extensible, that you can plug things into your documentation without necessarily breaking the functionality that's there. And I guess with that in mind, I'm just going to move right on to ASCII doc, which came in 2002 with a very readable syntax in direct response to DocBook, which we saw earlier. Sometimes I see people refer to ASCII doc almost interchangeably with ASCII doctor. I'm not sure why yet. But ASCII doctor is the documentation generator for ASCII doc, as far as I understand it. And it is, it's just, the community for ASCII doc is still very much active. 20 years later, there's a Slack channel in the Write the Doc Slack group, which is fairly active. I think 2 or 3 years ago at another Write the Docs conference, there was a discussion of transitioning to a docs as code workflow, relying on ASCII doc. So that's just to say it's still around, even if you may not have heard of it or touched it. And last markup language we'll look at here is Markdown, which you probably have encountered. I'm not going to get into the setbacks here because there are very many, and that's not, we don't have time for that. But it has been the default markup language for a lot of projects for many years now. But default does not necessarily mean that it's the best choice. It was not originally created with documentation in mind. I'm not sure about these days, but my understanding is that the documentation for Markdown itself has been lacking. And historically, it has lacked extensibility. It's lacked open standards until relatively recently with this open standard called Common Mark. But anyway, we will move on, inching closer to the present day, the past 4 or 5 years. If you see this chart of the top 5 markup languages in GitHub, which another technical writer in the community, it may have been him who prepared it, Fabrizio Ferri Benedetti. You can see by far most of the markup, most of the repositories in reference are using Markdown for their markup language. And then you see a few with restructured text, a few with DocBook, a few with AsciiDoc, and so on. Okay, that is a lot of information. I'm not sure that anybody enjoyed that, but there's still going to be more, so we will keep going. So now we will talk about MarkDoc, and I'm going to reference this presentation from a conference from 2020 that Ryan Paul gave to introduce MarkDoc to the community before it was open sourced. In contrast to the languages and the tools we looked at earlier, to the frameworks, MarkDoc is something that dynamically generates documentation content rather than statically generating it. And we can think of it as an authoring framework that enables the sort of docs as an application experience. It's basically written in JavaScript as far as I understand. And Ryan has referred to it as basically a superset of Markdown with some adjustments that make it behave a little bit differently from standard Markdown, I suppose. It does also reach beyond the paradigm of docs as code, it sounds like. I've seen in this presentation from 2020 that it enables something we might think of as docs as data, and I thought that was exciting, that there's the possibility with this framework of filtering and querying documentation as if it's a database. So it seems like with that, there are a lot of implications for perhaps your team, your project's team, or your workplace, that you can use maybe your internal observability tools to collect metrics or insights on how your documentation is being used, and then therefore improve the user experience for your documentation. And if I understood correctly, in case you haven't heard of MarkDoc, or well, in case you haven't heard of MarkDoc or where it's come from, it has been developed in-house at a company called Stripe, and there it's integrated with React, which allows the documentation content to be reactive, and that it can react to changes in state with the React application at hand. And I've heard references to cross-pollination, where users who are browsing the Stripe company documentation or interacting with the company, the user dashboard or the API reference. I'm speaking vaguely here, but what I understand is that the way that they've implemented and built the documentation there has allowed people to move pretty seamlessly between those contexts. So I don't know, that's making for a better user experience, I see. As mentioned earlier, this project, this authoring framework, MarkDoc, it has really benefited from the resources at Stripe. They've got a dedicated documentation product team. There are high expectations for the UX of the documentation and for the technical architecture. There's definitely a lot of high investment in that team and in this product. And if you have a moment to check out that presentation from 2020, you can find out more about how they've implemented it. I made a list here, but I don't think I'll get into it. So in 2022, they did open source MarkDoc, and we got another discussion, another presentation at another Write the Docs conference from Ryan Paul. And we learned that, yes, it was open sourced, And there's also a deeper discussion of user experience, developer experience, and authoring experience. And those are terms, I'd heard of user experience and developer experience for sure. Authoring experience, I've really only heard of in the context of this community or even just this authoring framework. Ryan, in his presentation, he referenced a natural tension between developer experience and authoring experience. I'm not going to pretend that I don't know what he's talking about, but here I will clarify that we're referring to authoring experience as a collection of tools and processes for creating, editing, and maintaining documentation throughout its entire life cycle. Like many of us, we've known that for a while, that there is this tension between developer experience and authoring experience, or perhaps if we want to break down authoring experience face-to-face, we can think of it as the experience we have for writing documentation, whatever our role is, whether it's as technical writers, developers and technical writers in one person, support people, product people, and so on. At Stripe, on this documentation product team, they acknowledged that very early on, and they also acknowledged that developer-centric workflows for contributing to the documentation, they are not very inclusive for people who are not developers. And they found early on that these workflows, in fact, reduced the number of people who were willing to self-serve when they wanted to contribute documentation changes. But my own thoughts are, oftentimes I think these two perspectives, developer experience and authoring experience, are quite often coupled. There's a wall between them, but it doesn't need to be there. And I'm thinking maybe that if we inhabit an authoring experience mindset more often, that could allow us to break down part of that wall. Maybe. Unfortunately, I take a moment to say that I wanted to have more thorough discussion of that. And the discussion I have here is not quite to my satisfaction, and I think I have less than 9 minutes left, so we will continue. Thank you. We're just going to part 2, the wall. Okay. So a bit more than 20 years ago, there was this, this notion of a wall of confusion in the DevOps world, which I understand to be a relatively young world at the time. And there was, at that time, not much awareness of the ecosystem that flows between developer work and operations work. And some people came up with this metaphor to refer to the challenges of running applications on large distributed infrastructure with operations people on one side of the wall and developer staff on the other side of the wall, with both of them having very different mindsets. And if we're thinking of this dichotomy, we were thinking of the operations staff more valuing or having more priority on stability, reliability, maintainability, and the sustainability of the systems that the software was running on. And to put it in a nutshell, if not entirely accurate, developer staff probably more valued rapid change and iteration at the expense of those other things. I guess this metaphor refers to the scenario where developers would write their code and then just throw it over the wall to the operations people on the other side, and then keep doing what they were doing, and then they would just never meet. They would just have this wall between them. But yeah, even though there's a natural tension between the two, nowadays we can refer to this infinity loop that maybe you have seen before. I did notice that there's no mention of communication in there. So I'm wondering, could it fit? Where might it fit? Probably not as a step, but I don't know. We have that open to the imagination right now. Yes, moving on. And just last year, I had the chance to attend FOSS Backstage 2024. I remember seeing this in another room with this presentation from Bertrand, who spoke about effective communication and how it enables deep work and a reduction in cognitive load, reducing friction between people, which I thought was quite relevant to these points in this loop. Also, just very briefly, a nod to AI. I didn't plan to talk very much about it, but because it is here among us, I thought I'd mention that, yes, it's a tool. I don't have answers for you. Nobody's asked for them yet. But I've been thinking about this a lot, especially in the past few months, and I wanted to emphasize that AI will not think for you, it will not know for you, and it will not communicate for you. And maybe that wasn't necessary to say, but I've said it. And I'm also thinking of it in the context of tools that are just not going to solve everything that we need to fix or address. Moving on quickly. So yeah, effective communication, naturally applicable to any area that there's a handoff between people or departments or teams or roles. Anywhere there's friction. Maybe we'll take a closer look at how UX and documentation design can also help us glue together these cracks, areas of friction. Another presentation I'll reference, but maybe more quickly than before, just from the Write the Docs conference in the US last year. We looked, in this presentation, we looked at the user experience of documentation from the perspective of somebody who was a developer and a technical writer, noting that for many years now, interacting on the web, we are interacting, we're scanning, we're not reading. We're not reading walls of text, clearly. We continue to value findability and searchability. For example, if we are learning front-end development or something with React, then we can expect to find in the documentation there a live sandbox that lets us directly interact with the sample code, tinker with it, and see those changes quickly, blah, blah, blah. 5 minutes left. Just last year, again, at this conference, FOSS Backstage, but in the design track, we had a presentation from Pedro, and I thought in this image from his slides, we're restoring some more context and shape to the work of documentation in terms of the people who are involved, the roles and the perspectives and the teams. And it made me think some more about how we might unflatten this work, because it's not a monolith. It takes different shapes. There are different formats, whether or not it's statically generated, it's text or not. Maybe it's not text, maybe it's audio, video, imagery, diagrams, other forms of media. And to wrap this part up, I thought, when we have documentation in the form of interactions, like ones that are enabled with, I don't know, MarkDoc or some front-end development framework that allows us to interact more with our learning or the content, those interactions can help us remember things more intuitively. And they seem to directly correspond more with how we experience reality than just passively looking at a screen. Just going to keep going very quickly. So, yeah, almost done with this section. Sometimes it seems like we're conceptualizing documentation almost in the same way we're thinking about monuments and statues. And, shouldn't our documentation keep up with the times? It's now 2025. I was thinking also in the natural world or in our real life world, sometimes there's a statue, gets damaged, and maybe our reflex is to think about what was there before and fix it and restore it to that state. But maybe those things were actually just very specific to a fixed point in time or a fixed period, and maybe it doesn't serve us anymore to restore them to those states, such as with the Berlin Wall, for example, because we're in Berlin. So we see over and over again, rushing, that knowledge and understanding are things that we need to create and recreate together. Maybe our old ways of thinking about documentation are no longer relevant. And even the subjects that we're trying to document, they themselves are changing and versioning. So we could also keep in mind, too, that language itself is very approximating, especially since we're developing and writing and communicating in a global community. And it just doesn't seem to make so much sense to rely so narrowly on tools that are making things so concrete and fixed, at least to our imagination. Okay, last part, almost done. Yeah, so I do think we could think of documentation as living stuff, living organisms. Unfortunately, too often we are visualizing them as pretty inert, lifeless. This might be the last presentation I'm referencing in this presentation, but it's very dear. It's from Daniele Procida, Write the Docs, Portland, 2021. OS Complete Never Finished. And he refers to the growth and development of a French being, having this organic directional growth occurring at the cellular level, even though none of the cells individually knows what's going on. They're just programmed or they're just doing their thing. And yet, at every stage of its development, it is a complete organism, even if it's not fully mature. I spent a lot of time reading about winter these past 3 months because it was difficult. It's a difficult season. But I took note of a lot of comparisons that we might take when we think about documentation and do it, where we have seed referring to mindset and soil referring to the infrastructure or the context that enables that mindset to flourish. Like that. So some last questions. I'm wondering if we might ask ourselves the roles that you play in documentation, that maybe you consider yourself a maintainer or provider of sorts or a contributor. These are like traditional terms that we hear and use in the community. And maybe we could also consider different terms, not really attached to that idea or these terms, just throwing that out there, just to, shake things up and think about things a little differently, not trying to police anything here. And yeah, I mean, we could go a bit further. I'm going back to that presentation where we're thinking about gardening and planting things. We could refer to ourselves as growers or carers or taking care of something that really needs attention. And as Daniele put it, nurturers of frogs and French beans. I will not get into this text here, but given a lot of the fires that happened in Los Angeles in the US in January, I read this and I thought, it stayed with me, noting that memory is a resource for facing the future. And forgetting creates terrible vulnerabilities. There, we're talking about something very different, but if you're building something that you want to persist and share with the world, seems worthwhile to take care of it in the same way that you might be preserving the history of something. Like, just rush through that. Okay, and that's all to say that documentation, knowledge preservation are integral to the overall health of our systems. So maybe we could try to care for their health and well-being with a different mindset in mind. Okay. Just some credits for the artwork I used, and naturally the presentation that I referenced at the end, which itself took from this 1981 textbook on biology. About the Orthodox community, there seems to be a lot of overlap with themes that I hear about here at FOSS Backstage that people here might be interested in. And we have a social event this Wednesday. There's more information on the FOSS Backstage website in the Fringe Events section. And thank you again for having me here, all of the organizers and the volunteers. And if you'd like to stay in touch, I am around. And that's where you can find me. So that's that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know the title, but today I was in the Winter Garden at a talk which gave an outlook or a comparison of different Linux communities, from Archetype to Debian to Ubuntu, and what their worldviews are and how this shapes how this works. So I think somehow these two talks clicked for me in the same region, because they said the mindset that you have that this is accessible for everyone, which is, for instance, for Ubuntu, whereas like the diametral opposite is Arch Linux, where they say, you need to understand the docs if you're a newbie, and then you can start contributing and be a tech expert, more or less, whereas Ubuntu takes you in the community as well as in the process of installing it by the hand and says, hey, we have to be accessible. And I think maybe it's not a question, but rather a statement that this talk inspired me, that this is more or less the same idea of saying we need to be open, we need to be not only developer experience, which kind of felt for me like this Arch Linux type, but we also want user experience and author experience. And I just liked your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, but yeah, if you didn't see the talk and you find this interesting, I think it was the second one today.
The auditorium, perhaps.
Or the first one in Winter Garden, actually, after the keynote.
Okay.
This was the one, if you're interested. I think it connects to your topic.
Thank you. I will check the schedule. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. More ideas?
I want to make a remark that what you're saying connects a lot with cybernetics and operational research. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the discipline of operational research, but in the United States, it developed as this thing that is very math-based, so mathematical models. In the United Kingdom, it developed to be something concerned with soft systems. So we have soft systems theory, and your approach is an approach that connects to systems theory and the soft operational systems, the idea of reconciling different worldviews and having a much more ample and wide perspective of the ecosystems that we are serving. And I did do a remark in a talk earlier today that we've been doing this over-specialization of people. We've been taking care of very little things and focusing on very small fields, whereas we are in dire need of more generalist professionals and people who can think systemically. And I think that connects to what you've been saying as well. And I want to emphasize here again.
Oh, thank you. That's good to know. I didn't have a chance to listen to the presentation, so there's another one I will check. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
I don't see any more raised hands. So thanks again for your talk.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for showing up.
Thank you.